This is the Make Planning Make Sense podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest this episode is Marko Salopek, Senior Project Manager at Muse. Marko comes at the discussion from his particular perspective as part of a prestigious public-private partnership placemaking powerhouse, Muse. This conversation was a lot of fun, but it also makes a compelling argument for imperfection and grace. It's been remarkable that so many conversations with the built environment sector carry themes of anxiety, perfectionism, overwhelm, and the fear of guilt. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the negative themes live in those gaps between how the system was designed and how it's come to operate. And what I've really appreciated is how our conversation with Marko and others on the podcast identify practical opportunities to fix and fill those gaps. Please give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend the show to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MPMS Podcast, on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here's our conversation with Marko Salopek. Marko Salopek of Muse, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure.
We're joined as well by my colleague and occasional co-host, Aaron Zimmerman.
Thanks, Aaron.
And Marko, we're really keen to talk about planning from the perspective of a developer, but then also from the perspective of a placemaker. Muse does really fascinating and complex, high-quality projects, and it works very well in the UK context, but it also means the navigation of that in order to make these extremely high-quality places.
Yes.
Before we dive in, we always like to start with a bit about who you are and how you came to your role.
Sure. Yeah. If I just start with Muse and then work through my long history. I'm a senior project manager at Muse. We are a regeneration specialist, national in that sense. We focus on placemaking, creating neighborhoods that serve communities, serve the people, and we essentially focus on creating better places, better towns, cities, essentially within those areas. We would never describe ourselves as your typical developer in that sense. One of our key principles are focusing on community, focusing quality of place.
Yeah, like when I said developer, it felt almost weird to say it.
No, it's a fair point because we're a placemaker. And the way I describe ourselves externally is the focus on mixed-use places. So we wouldn't do something that's like a single use, purely residential, purely offices. We wouldn't do that. So for us, there needs to be that element of placemaking that essentially create a better environment. We will leave a better legacy for community, for the neighborhood, for local people, but also for the wider residents, users as well. So that's quite key. And I'm looking forward to discussion as well as from a project management perspective as well. I'm not your sort of typical development manager. I do have development management colleagues. So I'm more looking at things from cost perspective and time and technical and pulling my hair out. I mean, just to explain more about my role within Muse, and then I'll talk about my history more generally. I essentially work on schemes from 200 homes to 2,000 homes, all sort of complex urban region. There's always sort of something on the side that we need to resolve. And that's what makes it interesting. You're not just going there building house offices and that's it. You are also at the same time adding value and trying to solve a problem. But if I give you a bit of wider background, I did my undergrad in civil and structural engineering back in Croatia, where I'm originally from. And then I decided to specialize in construction project management. Mm-hmm. To do that, I moved to UK. I did that in Belfast, Queen's University Belfast, which I really enjoyed. I could talk about Belfast for hours. And then after I finished that, I started working in the industry. I started off as a consultant project manager. Then I moved client side and essentially stayed client side since then. I've worked on sort of varied projects from Battersea Power Station. I worked on a lot of kind of smaller estates regeneration projects when I was at Clarion. I worked on some large BTR scheme in London, in Bermondsey specifically, 1,600 homes. There's a bit of PBSA there. There's a bit of civic use buildings I worked on as well, a town hall, all sorts. But I think my underlying experience and also what brought me to Muse eventually was that focus on mixed use, mm-hmm. placemaking, technical challenges, but also wider challenges.
Yeah, and one of the themes that has come up in quite a few of the podcast episodes that Aaron's done so far is a sense of mistrust between the development industry and planning departments. Do you think that with Muse's emphasis on sort of social value and placemaking, that helps to wear away at that mistrust and build some positive trust with councils?
That's a good question. Look, for example, we work pretty much with public sector bodies, local authorities, and we try to deliver essentially 50% affordable housing in our schemes. So we're quite open about the issues we're facing there. We're not shying away, and it's essentially to bring people on the journey, to be open and transparent, and to not be that developer that shuts the doors and doesn't tell what's going on, and then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, we've got this problem, to perpetuate that bad developer. Far from it. We work in partnership with local authorities as landowners, with local authorities in terms of planning authorities. And look, we will talk about issues we have, and in some cases, to be quite honest, we do face some headwinds with local planning departments. They don't necessarily understand the challenges on a kind of wider scale. We like to, share issues, share solutions, learn from each other. To go back to your question, ask it more specifically, we still in some cases do find those challenges in terms of that, yes, you are delivering 50% affordable, yes, you have all the Building Safety Act challenges, but still we want X, Y, and Z. That is a challenge. I think we need to work more on how we communicate that, and also just drive home that narrative. What are we doing and why? There's one example that I used to use in my colleagues in project management role, but I think there's also examples in kind of design planning world. I'll start with the project management one. When you're working like a big project and you might be completely engrossed in something, and there used to be kind of like a joke, look, 2 years down the line, nobody's going to remember how amazing that Excel spreadsheet looks. People will forget about it. People will remember the place you're creating. People will remember how they feel, what it means to them, the roof you're putting over their head. That's what matters. Not, oh, does this report look amazing and are all the T's crossed and I's dotted and formatting in Excel right? That becomes irrelevant. And if you take that more to urban design, architecture, planning, I guess there's also a question like, is this particular detail so important? If it's stopping us from building housing, if it's delaying us from building that housing or adding extra cost. It's that situation where you have to ask yourselves and work with others to bring them back and say, what is the ultimate goal here? We've got a housing crisis. We need to build more homes. That's what we want to achieve. So if the shade with the brick is not the right one, does it really matter that much, dare I say?
Condition it.
We do relate. Is it really worth not having this entire medical research practice and education campus a year sooner? Is the difference in those S1 obligation heads of terms more important than the big picture, than the outcome?
Yeah. And also, what is the whole delay about? Because it might be about something so small and like in the grand scheme of things, not an impactful there, I say. As you say, you've got a life science building. If it's built a year earlier than later, they might be using those facilities, do cancer research, whatever other good work they'll be doing, which has bigger benefit to society. That's not to say, let's cut corners and make all the buildings ugly, not functional, and not do anything through 106 or essentially support the infrastructure.
For sure, yeah.
But there needs to be a balance in terms of the reasonableness of that all. And I think, trying to remember the detail, but I think I might have been in a similar situation where I was working on a 100% affordable scheme and it got stuck in 106. Planning was approved. 106 generally was approved. It was almost like agreeing the final minor points and getting it executed. And dare I say, it took us about 6 months to get it over the line.
Yeah.
Like literally weekly, I was sending emails. And you kind of think like, how did we end up in that situation? What is the cause of that? I don't want to point the fingers to anyone, but I just sort of, where did things go wrong that we kind of lost sight of where we want to be?
Yeah. We're often saying to stakeholders, often officers at the LPA, well, hold on, let's take a step back. Somebody thinks that a flat layout is just like a little bit convoluted, right? Okay, yeah. And there is often a reason why, because of space constraints on the site. And you think, is it still going to be a good place to live, right? Is the broad question there. Even if it's like second pick produce, like it'll still be a delicious apple.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Muse has this really positive approach that we try to take in our work as well, where it's an open door, open honesty policy. Come and talk to us. We're often trying to get that conversation going. And once we do, it's beneficial to everybody. And when we talk about process versus outcome, we're also talking about risk aversion in a way. What's your experience been with risk aversion and the role that it plays in the practice of your work?
That's a good question. Looking at my professional history, I work at different organizations where the risk aversion really was in a wide range, in a sense of, in some places, fairly risk averse. You can't have the mentality of, oh, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I think perhaps Muse is a bit more risk averse because we are working in partnership with kind of local authorities, public bodies, but we also have a couple of partnerships that we're part of, Habico and ECF. And I think there's an element of kind of reputation at stake, in a sense of we want to deliver what we're saying, but we're still thinking, what is the end goal here? And how do we get there? It's a balance in that sense. Because let's say you don't want to end up in a situation where you push the envelope too far and it backfires.
Yeah.
And I think we are taking, in certain situations, pragmatic approach. We listen to the feedback we get, whether it's planning officers or other key stakeholders in that process. We listen to them and we respond. And to be quite honest, sometimes that response, it does have its limits in terms of what we can do. I keep banging on about building homes, and yes, that is a guiding thought, but that means sometimes that we can't necessarily deliver what everybody expects. All the details, all the kind of, we need to go back and say, well, look, we are facing challenges and we need to do something about it.
That's literally our job.
Exactly. And that's sort of the reality, that's the world we live in. You need to respond to the circumstances, and that might mean that you need to assess what you can actually implement. And I'm talking here again, homes, focusing on homes is make sure that's really good quality. Let's make sure the building functions well, the fire safety is there, it's not compromised. But that might mean that we can't have fully mature tree, but it actually have to be a tree that somebody just put a seed into the ground. Again, slightly exaggerating the example, but but I mean, and then you have to be patient and see that tree growing over the next 5-6 years to be that full kind of mature canopy. But things like that, people might see, oh, it's fine, it's irrelevant, it doesn't have any implications. Well, it does have quite big implications on cost.
Yeah.
And when you multiply it across big development, it has massive impact. And I remember working on one of my previous projects where trees were a big issue, in terms of the number of trees that was planted was the one that was promised from day one, but they just weren't 5-year-old mature trees. They were much younger, but it had the cost impact there was millions.
And the problem will be solved within 5 years.
Exactly.
By itself.
Yeah.
I like how you broke down the risk involved in process into finer detail, because one type of risk, it sounds, is this is a problem, but I'm choosing to ignore it for today. And then another type of risk is I know that will be a decision point later, but I know it's not the decision point today. And I think that the distinction between those two kinds of identification of risk can get muddled sometimes in the process of planning. The what if anxiety, to use probably the largest word in the word cloud of our podcast. I've also wanted to ask about your experience with risk aversion in the built environment, so this physical spatial design risk aversion, which is a really persistent challenge, even outside conservation areas, even outside the settings of listed buildings. There's a risk aversion to seeing something, well, the term is always changing the character context of an area, which has always fascinated me because every momentous and historically significant period in this country's history has been during a period of tremendous change in the built environment.
Indeed.
How do you reconcile the risk aversion of change in principle and then also just dive headfirst into an entire town center regeneration, for example? Where do you start that conversation, and how do you talk about that with officers or with your development partners?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I feel like there's a lot of risk aversion in that sense.
Yeah.
And we've lost that ability to innovate to some extent. And when we think about some buildings that have been listed recently, I think today or this week, if I understand correctly, up to last few years, those buildings when they were built were standing out in a kind of however you want to define the term. And I'm thinking about South Bank Centre, I'm thinking about Lloyd's building. They're both listed. I think South Bank got listed this week, if I understood that correctly.
It was this week.
Yeah. And people have different opinions about that building. They vary. But somebody decided to be bold and do something different. And actually that inevitably left a legacy maybe people weren't expecting it would leave in terms of positive legacy.
Yeah.
And, sometimes, not sometimes, but like, why not give that a go? Why does everything always have to be the replica of the same? Although I will contradict myself on that one in a moment. So I think we need to remind ourselves, and you rightly point out, Aaron, as well, is a lot of the good stuff was done during tremendous change. And now we're saying, oh, that's not good, we don't want to change. We should be allowed to experiment a bit more. We should, I think, in my opinion, be a bit more flexible.
Yeah.
And that has impact on so many different levels. I think larger master planners, larger contractors probably have that kind of safer space in terms of the projects they're doing. But what about SMEs and smaller developers?
Yeah.
And if they get penalized, that's a big challenge because we are, as a kind of wider society, saying we need to support smaller businesses, but then at the same time, we're creating these barriers. And to go back to the contradiction point, on the flip side, I think there's a space within the planning environment that you say, allow same topologies to be built with, say, less checks. And what I mean by that is if you've got two buildings that look the same, layouts are the same, and everything's the same, in two different locations, one kind of, have passed the test. Why does the other one have to go through the same level of scrutiny? If the issue is the way they look and they can't look exactly the same, well, none of us can essentially clone themselves and teleport and be at two locations at the same time looking at two buildings and be like, oh yeah, that one looks exactly like that one over there and it's nice.
I know exactly what you mean. And this is a really interesting thing because a lot of concepts, it can be applied well, it can be applied poorly.
Yeah.
A place where, speaking only from my own personal opinion, I think it's applied poorly is in suburban residential developments where it's just a brick cube, there's no detailing, and it is just the ugliest house I think I could possibly imagine. No, it's being dramatic. But it is unpleasant.
Yeah.
In contrast, there are entire conservation areas that are precisely of historic interest because it all looks the same. London County Council housing, beautiful, but plain, it all looks the same.
Yeah.
Or variations at least on a theme, right? So there isn't really a barrier in principle, I think, to sameness. So what if there's a building in Barnet that looks the same as a building in Sutton?
No, exactly. And like from that point of view, yeah, as long as they're nice, they're in different locations. And a lot of the buildings, not just housing, if you look around, are pretty much exact type. There's a style. I mean, I think the key word here is style. There are buildings of the same style which pretty much look the same. There's like hundreds of them, and that's fine. As long as we're not being so prescriptive that everything must look like that. And that's where sometimes in the planning world, there's a challenge of you need to match materiality over the local context. And is that sometimes get pushed too far in the sense of everybody else is using brick, you must be using brick. You can't use any other material. Or the windows need to be of this color because everybody else. In conservation area where there's like a really good reason, completely get that. But in some cases, you just wonder, why can't we spice this up a bit?
Yeah, and even in conservation areas where there is something so distinctly different, it becomes either its own visual interest or it's the exception that proves the point.
Yeah.
Give me a row of terraces and then make one just a total glass facade. And you just, that's, whoa, cool, right? Make it nice again.
If somebody does something crazy, in people's personal opinion, might be, let's say, ugly, but it's a talking point as well. It makes people think about what is architecture, what is housing, what purpose does it serve. And to slightly digress, with a specific example is, back in Croatia, back in Zagreb, there's a house that was built by a fairly well-known local architect for a private client, which completely turned the concept of a house on its head. It was talked about for weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
And it made people talk about, what is good architecture, what is the role of the planning system, and it kind of stirred everybody in a sense. Look, if you ask me, is it the most pleasant looking building? Personally, no. But it's got value because we're talking about it. And I hear those same comments like, oh, it's awful. I say, yeah, it might not look great on a personal opinion level, but actually there's also what it's telling me. There's a story to it. And for me, like sometimes with the built environment and architecture, not fitting into the mold, the benefit is that you talk about things, you talk about what they mean, and you allow all of us to be more creative, not just through the process, but people who look at the building on a day-to-day basis.
One of the persistent challenges in the discretionary system is that very question that you just asked rhetorically, do I personally like it that much? is an actual policy expectation.
Yes.
And that's really challenging. I also really appreciated your point about new things often being unwelcomed when they first arrive. The Eiffel Tower is another example of something.
The Barbican, we can see it out the window if the acoustic curtains went up.
We put up some acoustic curtains when we record because otherwise I'm too jarred by the landscape contrast that the Barbican provides. You know, the Eiffel Tower, hate it.
Yeah.
Tower Bridge, totally panned in the architecture critics columns.
Yeah.
And it might not be too recent by the time we release the episode, but Liverpool Street Station redevelopment was just approved by the City of London. That is of a scale, of a placemaking that Muse wasn't involved in.
No.
But it's in your alley.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That would be phenomenal to be involved with. Imagine the impact you're creating on the space. So slightly jealous there, to be honest. But I mean,
it can take time to digest these things.
Well,
right?
exactly. You know, you kind of get faced with a change and you maybe immediately think of the worst and you don't realize what benefits and upsides to that, and it takes time. But once you get there, like, it's amazing. So I think maybe it's a similar situation here as well, where a lot of people have went and, oh my God, we don't like this proposal, without actually letting it maybe settle down in a sense and just giving a bit time to breathe and understand what it is. And I know there have been like a few different ideas, but the one that got approved, again, like for me, kind of first impression is it evokes emotions. It evokes some feelings and goes back to the question, is that what the architecture should be doing? Yeah. So is it doing the right thing? Possibly. In terms of the quality and the design, again, we can be talking about this, but it's subjective. But what I think it does really well is it marries up and maybe almost like slightly too much in your face, the old and the new. And I've just realized pretty much as it got approved now, some of the themes and some of the details that it's putting. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. It took me a while to get to that point. Whereas what I mean specifically, you've got the brick vaults, the new proposed brick vaults. And you think, what is supposed to be? Trees, something else? And it took me a while to realize it replicates the sort of the steel structure of the roof vaults of the station that are already there. So there's a theme. There's like completely different material, giving me homage to what's already there.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Yes. Within the station level.
At the quarter entrance where there's like a fluted crest coming up.
Yeah. And that's incredible.
I just love it. I think it's so great. And then if you go down the passage, what is it called? Sunset Passage or something like that. That almost triumphant, like parabolic arc evolves and then becomes more of a twisted column arch and then evolves again continuously until it's the brick Gothic arches of the original historic fabric as you go down the train shed.
Exactly. It's really, really clever. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then you've got the new build on top, the sort of the glass.
And so what?
Exactly. You know, the glass building with kind of a lot of the greening element and gave it a new lease of life. You know, you've got one world lower down there and essentially something else up there.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, I think we need to be, why not be brave, trying to introduce something new, elevate something older and bring the two together to give it a sort of new life, elevate it. And I think that's courage of the team who've done that, and to some extent also the courage of the City of London planning team and all the members who support it. I think that's great because you could very easily go and say, no, it looks a certain way, it's a Gothic train station and we all need to be the same material and look exactly the same, we can't move away. It's a brave step forward. In some cases, that brave step forward might not be the right answer, but the fact that it's possible and it's being enabled and supported, it's great.
And they're keeping the historic fabric.
Exactly.
The stuff that they're removing is from 1990.
Yeah.
And there is something to what you're saying about almost a bravery, or is it a bravery or confidence? Why can't we be as sure of ourselves as the Victorians?
Yeah, I think we can. Well, actually depends.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm just thinking of one specific example where similar situation, but on a much smaller scale, where essentially we were proposing a residential building, and this is one of my kind of past lives project, basically proposing a building next to another building which had listed elements, and we were told essentially that we can't do it because it's harming the listing, harming the building. And we've asked the heritage officer in terms of, okay, how is it harming? Like how specifically?
What elements of its significance are being...
Exactly. So we can understand in terms of, can we address that? Is it possible? But also there I said to some extent how valid that comment is. And we've asked a question and we didn't get an answer. The answer was, well, it's harmful. Okay, but how? Why? To which bit? The element that was listed was actually internal within the building, the building, so you can't actually necessarily see it on the outside as well.
Yeah.
And so you go around in circles asking a question, okay, but why? How? And you don't get the answer. Yeah. And this is a gap that probably is fairly evident and that we should all, both sides, try to bridge is we want to understand what makes it harmful or not acceptable, but we would also in return like that to be fairly well argumented and objective. So you know what parameters are. Because I think one of the challenges we're facing as an industry, and this is broader issues, that lack of consistency, that something might be acceptable in one location but not in the other, all things being equal. That doesn't help anyone. Then you also have a situation where as you move between, say, London boroughs, policies are different. And that's quite challenging because you don't know what necessarily to expect. Not to go into the whole developer speak, but there's that whole chain of people like certainty. Master planners like certainty, your investors like certainty. And if you move from one side of the street to the other and you no longer know which role you're operating, it's a problem. And that's big challenge. So the fundamental question is, how can we be more certain? So I know we talked a lot about so far about being more courageous, have crazy ideas, be more bold, and at the same time I'm saying, let's be more certain. I think those two can live side by side very easily.
Oh, absolutely. Bull in a china shop. No. But they're very much overlapping, aren't they?
Yeah, because there should be an element of, essentially, you can do this. I wouldn't say no challenges, like, yes, do challenge, but essentially it is acceptable. There's consistency, there's certainty, you know what you can expect. But beyond that, if you are doing something crazy, maybe you need to prove a bit more. But I find it slightly puzzling where you ask those questions, what is harmful here, what is not acceptable, and you don't get an answer. That doesn't help, let's say, us, the design team, the architect, address that, understand that also doesn't help the officer to get a result what they want. But it also then, taking a bigger point, doesn't help the wider society to deliver those outcomes, whether it's housing, whether it's school, whether it's something else. You're stuck in the loop in terms of how do we unlock this?
Yeah.
And Aaron, I think you might have discussed it in a previous episode, but I think what you've got in mind there, Marko, is almost like a sort of fast track route for design, where if it's a standard building and certain minimum expectations are met, then it gets pushed through more quickly. And then if you are looking to do something a bit more challenging and a bit more controversial, then that has an extra layer of scrutiny, but then you ideally get the best of both worlds in that you get quicker developments through, but then also get more interesting buildings. And
the way I see that, it's very easy to portray this is what developers want and this is what helps them. I think that also helps planning departments massively because it's also about them being more efficient, but with the view that if they have to do less, they can focus more on stuff that matters. So if we have same building typologies, materiality, etc., going through in locations, they've got local plans and it's all the designations, fast track it, unburden the officers. There's that element of how can they be more empowered, not to focus on something that actually is to some extent like a bit repetitive and doesn't add value and such. They've approved it here, same thing applies there, move on.
Making sure the spreadsheet looks tidy, to borrow your analogy from before.
Well, exactly.
Cross the T's of the survey that doesn't have any decision-making point at the end of it. Yeah.
Or, you know, like where you've got situations, you end up with a planning permission, you've submitted all the details and you still have a lot of conditions. You kind of have to go through the same thing twice then. Doesn't make sense. So I think the fundamental question, and I think we need to work on that, the drive for efficiency and consistency is not only to benefit developers, master planners, designers. It's really to benefit everyone in the system, officers, councillors, just to have the more certainty to enable people to, as we've said, focus on really what matters, to focus on those slightly more challenging, unusual applications where you actually need to look a bit closer to it, but not focus on shades of brick.
We will be right back. There's this weird inverse relationship between the level of risk that a development plan is willing to accept in its proposals and the relative risk that is shouldered by the developers in a way that reduces their efficiencies and reduces their sort of available capital for going and getting stuff done a little bit faster. And just to sketch it out, right? If every single application needs to do like a utility survey, because 1 in 1,000 of them is going to run into an unforeseen issue with utilities on the side.
That's probably actually a wrong example, but I should continue.
Oh, damn it.
The reason I'm saying as a project manager, I want a utility survey, like you need one. But I know what you mean.
But is it a planning thing? No.
Actually, better example, and I think this was talked in one of your podcasts, was the transport survey. If you got a PTAL of 6, why do you need to do that?
And it's car free.
Exactly.
By obligation,
So,
and it's in a CPZ.
Yeah.
What is the parking stress survey for?
Why?
Yeah.
You know, who for? That feels redundant. You're doing something, you're already complying to prove something. And even, I mean...
That one's to the nth degree because there's no risk at all.
Yeah.
At all. Like, I think maybe an example might be a noise assessment for a residential development that's not next to a motorway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let the developer take on that risk instead of making the application take on that risk to address it all. Make them figure it out because they will. They'll have to, because you could just secure it by a post-completion report.
Well, exactly. Or, I mean, the other examples we probably have seen is, well, will that use type work in this particular location? Or we have so much of X, why do we need another one? Then I actually had quite recently a discussion about that where I said, well, why not everyone build the use they're proposing in this location? They'll shoot themselves in the foot if it's not viable down the line, like if nobody wants to essentially live in those buildings. Because if you're so worried about affordable housing and you all of a sudden have a oversupply, what are the consequences of that? Perhaps the rents will go down.
Yeah.
Perhaps it will be cheaper to live in those places. Like we, to some extent, have become so risk averse and so like needing that certainty that sometimes lack of certainty actually could play out quite well. And I think, look, I'm trying to understand where all that's coming from. And it's probably coming from a place where there were certain things done in the past which weren't quite right. We still regulate for that. If you still allow for that over provision, you still have housing standards, which means that there's still a level of quality that you must meet. But that oversupply, let it be. Why? If people are so interested,
it's more a commercial risk that is not necessarily within planning's needs to control. But frankly, and I've said this before, it's not really in planning's gift to control. If we think about like a major residential development in Greater London, the variety of expectations placed on it could be seen as essentially taking all priorities and making sure each one is exactly proportionally addressed on this small site as though it were the city entire, right?
Yeah.
Oh my, there's too many 2-bed units. Okay. Of course you can't have an entire avenue of studio apartments. That's true too, but that's just not where we are.
And even, again, absurd case, even if you did, so what? Because the housing needs surveys have so many people, the housing registers are so long. If you take a borough, you're talking about easily 10,000 households per each borough in London on the housing needs, housing waiting list. And if you build, say, 52 beds instead of 10, you're just making a small dent. Like, why not have that flexibility sometimes? And sometimes that flexibility might mean that you can actually unlock sites. So, yes, if everyone starts building only 2-bed apartments, we probably have a problem there. But if somebody now and then decides to build only 2 beds in a development because it, for some reason, whatever, makes sense to them, why not let them? Why not let some experimentation there? No developer wants a viable scheme. I'm sure they'll take care of that and think how they can mitigate if things don't work out. But you also have a situation where I appreciate it's CapEx intensive, but you might then change those units into smaller units or large units, whatever it's needed.
That's an interesting point as well, and it's probably worth emphasizing. Whatever we build or whatever we advise on or determine today will not be exactly what's shown on the drawings in 20 years. It just won't.
Yeah.
And so there's a bit of an unspoken presumption that what we're doing next for that thing will be eternal. And of course, everybody would say, well, no, that's not how we, of course it won't be. But it goes back to that point about having that degree of humility and grace about what we can actually determine. And we're probably assessing things that we actually don't have a lot of control over.
That's a very good point.
As though we do.
Yeah, and it's probably from how we live, and not to talk about market, but also how market operates, I guess, more short term. Like how we live have changed drastically over the last 10 years. If you look at it more from technical perspective, all your buildings have design life of 50, 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
So in theory, 50, 60 years down the line, you're supposed to demolish them all. Hopefully not, because that's bad for the environment. Hopefully some will outlive that. But if kind of that's the guiding thought, then you think, well, actually in 50 years' time, we're going to demolish this building and it will be something completely different.
It kind of lowers the stakes, doesn't it?
Yeah. But if you talk about how we live, say 10 years ago, especially if we focus on UK, BTR wasn't such a huge thing, co-living wasn't. Things have changed. What does the next 10-year bring? We all think it's going to bring the same, possibly not. We might end up more of the co-living, more of the sharing, maybe not. We might maybe end up with more intergenerational homes. Those are very rarely, I feel, talked about. So will there be something completely new that we can't foresee? Potentially.
Yeah.
So things change. I think this
You
is
heard it here first.
yeah.
When it comes to unit mix as well, I think there's often a debate where a developer is trying to propose too many in the eyes of the local authority of smaller units, so one beds or studios. And the point that the council will make is that we need more family homes. But I think a lot of the time those discussions miss the fact that the proportion of family homes that is needed is based on a housing market assessment that was potentially produced a few years before a local plan was adopted, because it's an evidence-based document, and then a few years might have passed. And also it doesn't seem to recognise the secondary benefits that you get from, even where you are proposing a higher proportion of smaller units, what that does to the wider housing market, in that the people who buy those homes are potentially renting in a shared home, and then that frees up. And often those points are in the housing market assessment and they're made in detail. Sometimes that nuance gets lost on how all these things are interacting in the housing market.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what gets lost is sometimes also diversity of tenure to some extent and what role that plays.
To be fair as well to local plan policies, diversity of unit size is also, I think, a good thing in principle, because it creates a shared space of a building where you have multiple types of families in multiple stages of their lives, and that is good for cohesion.
No, I mean, that's a fair point. But equally, we've got a multi-phase development where essentially it's 3 phases. Each phase is essentially different tenure. So we've got phase 1, open market sale. We've got also affordable housing there. We're now looking at phase 2, which is essentially BTR, with again affordable housing. And we're looking to change third phase essentially to co-living. And the way you can look at each of the phase individually and be thinking, oh, well, is this the right thing? But if you look at all of them collectively, there's kind of a story in terms of we can maybe start off in the co-living, move to BTR, move and kind of buy. So you've got the sort of journey within the same location with the same community. And I think it also gives resilience to the place in the sense of, if your needs change, you don't need to move out. You can stay within the same location. You've made friends. You've established yourself there. You can stay there. And it's really important to recognize all of that, well, individual, but also cumulatively. And sometimes, as I say, you can fall into the trap of looking at particular use type, mixed use, and think, well, that's not good enough. We don't like this. But it's important. And I think, again, let's look at a wider development, bigger picture. Yeah. And also sometimes what gets lost within, let's say, perhaps build-to-rent element or maybe even co-living is that if your homes are not meeting certain criteria, let's say dual aspect is probably a good example. If you live in a build-to-rent community, it's easier to change it because essentially you can go to your concierge leasing team and say, well, look, I don't like the east-facing unit anymore. I like west-facing. Do you have anything available? And the answer might be yes, we have now, or we might have it in 3 months. Like, your needs might change, might evolve. You can still stay within that community. And it's quite important, is recognizing and supporting the diversity of tenures and residential uses, that you have that kind of mix of opportunities that ultimately will enable people to stay. In some cases, you should be maybe allowed a bit more flexibility when it comes to essentially design, which might help you with viability.
If you're going to move to a new house because you want a sunrise rather than a sunset, or vice versa, you'd like to think that person, rare though they might be, would be the kind of person who would know what kind of sun they're going to get when they move into that first place.
True. But I mean, like, look, I'm using that as an example.
We're trying to control things we do not necessarily have the ability to control.
Maybe that isn't the right example. The better would be in terms of the size of homes.
Sorry, I'm being really particular
No,
because
okay.
your broader point
Yeah.
about flexibility within a managed building
Yeah.
is very well taken. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that's not unusual. People who have a one bed and then have a kid will talk to their building management and say, we're looking actually at a two bed.
Exactly.
Is something available?
And then when needs change, you move around. Because we talked about the sun rising on the east and all of that. That's a good example in the sense of, look, I'm obsessed ultimately with views. And I've got some friends who don't care. I've got one friend who would literally gladly live in a dark box surrounded by walls and still don't understand it to this day. So look, but we're approaching this from the point of view that everyone will want the same thing, that everyone will put the same value on every single element, and people might not.
It's a really important point.
So looking at that friend who literally would be happiest if he lives in a cave, he won't care about dual aspect. And yes, he might not look to buy specifically, but he might be pushed to buy, maybe he wants two bed, but all dark. These are really extreme examples. But he'll be pushed, and that dual aspect doesn't add any value to him, and he just wastes cost.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point. And I'm trying to picture the counter argument, right? But what if they just don't think about the world like we do, and they don't consider aspect and overheating and whether it has mechanical ventilation and I'm like, well, yeah, okay, sure. Again, probably people are not noticing it or living it in the exact specificity then in which we're imagining it, but we can't control that. I think the really classic example that spurred the London Plan's agent of change policy is the person who buys the flat next to the nightlife venue, which was built because the nightlife venue was attracting investments, and then badgers the council because the nightlife venue is too loud.
Yeah.
Or like the person who moves into the flat above the bar.
Yeah. I think there's a certain area in
Does
London.
she not know what she's getting into by moving to a flat above a bar?
Yeah.
And if so, great. And if she doesn't actually anticipate that, how is that planning's problem?
I guess that's a good question. Perhaps it goes back to the question around how we empower planning officers to push back on that. Because you touched upon earlier in terms of kind of various levels of controlling the risk.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about kind of planning and perhaps where maybe we're facing challenges, but there are control mechanisms there. We just need to let the planning system use those checks and mechanisms to control and not layer it with another layer of checks with another. We've got planning, which deals with planning policies. We've got building regulations, building control. We are now seeing situations where like the two are being mixed into one, where kind of one is overstepping into the other and vice versa. And I also had one example professionally in the past where we were dealing with some concerns essentially through planning process fairly well. But I was asked, but can we put other restrictions on this? I know I'm being slightly deliberately vague and it's not helpful.
It's so cryptic.
Sorry. But basically, kind of my response was, we've got planning system here to deal with this. We're planning officers, we'll deal with this pre-apps, there'll be pushback, there'll be committee, they'll run through all of this. If this isn't acceptable, they'll come to decision. We need to make sure that the planning officers and planning system is, in cases where it really need to be, are enabled to kind of push back, challenge, and control, because essentially that's what they're there for. So if somebody comes to them and says, well, you look, the nightclub is too loud and they've moved there because of the nightclub, as I say, it shouldn't be a planning matter. It should be basically somebody in planning department saying, well, what are you getting into? It's buyers beware situation to some extent. Common sense in a way, because again, if all of a sudden becomes a planning issue, using planning resources, taking them away from something else, having them to deal with an issue which actually isn't theirs as such.
Yeah.
So I think we can also very easily waste people's time and resources in that sense, and not allowing the officers to focus on what they need to focus on and what actually matters.
This has sort of shifted to a policy-making discussion, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
I would love to draft a local plan. Give me a weekend. I'm going to make...
What's your top policy then? What's going in your plan?
Policy 1.1a is that the rest of the document will not use the phrase live, work, and play.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I've cut 30 pages off the London plan. I think for me, and I actually kind of want to do this with the London plan at some point when I have like a balance of free time and willpower, is to go through and see what can be done about stuff that is building regs, right?
Yeah.
And under the new MPPF, if it's adopted as drafted, that will be gone. Get rid of vague hierarchies that are putting way too much pressure on case officers, especially if they're new in their careers, to be philosophers about what sufficient carbon sort of emissions balance is relative to site optimization. I think that's an unfair burden to put on officers. Do you have any dream changes or policymaker for the day?
That's a good one. You mentioned building regs, and there is misalignment between regs and various policies. And that proverbial, we need to save energy, which means that everything needs to be well insulated, which means the apartments are hotter, which means you need to put air conditioning in, which means you then use a lot of carbon. So that doesn't marry up. Or if you introduce to that equation, you need to save energy, well insulated, smaller windows, worse daylight sunlight, or however you want to spin it. There are so many variations to this. So it's just essentially going back to kind of basics of, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the most important bit here? Or actually, how do we balance? Because you want quality of life. You want that daylight sunlight in the apartments, in the sort of living space, bedrooms, etc., etc. You want to enable that, but you can't then really put that completely subservient to other requirements. It's a balance. And I guess to your point, the challenge there is, how do we enable officers to make that balanced decision that allow them to be guilt-free in terms of it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be very good.
I really like that. Allow them to be guilt-free.
Yeah.
Sincerely, that's going to stick with me.
I think we've all been in that situation, especially when you're more junior. You have that nagging feeling of, well, what if I do this and what are the consequences and will it come to bite me? Have I made an error and wrong decision?
I've been asked to assess and resolve all of these issues, and then you find out they're not resolvable.
Yeah.
That is hard.
So really empowering them to have that element of guilt-free to make a decision, say, I've looked at X, I've looked at Y, and on balance, I think this is okay. Because let's be honest, they're the experts. And we need to kind of empower them and encourage them and, I say, really be guilt-free to make those decisions. I do have a lot of sympathy because it's challenging. I've seen a lot of good case officers who supported projects and who've also fought the good fight and also fought against external pressures. And I think that also needs to be commended because it goes back to that partnership bit. We shouldn't be working against each other. We should be working together.
Yeah.
But it's about how do we balance our requirements and how we essentially don't end up being entrenched for whatever reasons. And I think the big element there is that enable them to make guilt-free decisions. Also, be able to think for themselves, not necessarily rely on policy or procedure or document every single time. I know we talk about we want consistency, that is important, but sometimes it backfires. Another example I would give is where I submitted a listed building consent for some internal work. And one of the response from a validation checklist was, but have you done biodiversity checklist for within the building? So
the examples aren't rare. Yeah, it's a thing.
So that's a process where maybe somebody takes comfort in the process.
Yeah.
In terms of there's a checklist, I'll follow the checklist. Whereas we need to enable people in that situation to actually go and say, well, hold on, this is internal. This checklist is meaningless.
Yeah.
We don't need to do this. And then not to have that kind of guilt on themselves to think, what will their boss say in terms of, oh, have you done this and is there a checklist to fill out? Yeah. There isn't one because there's just no need to have one because it's not relevant. So I think there's that element of empowerment, how we can support officers in that sense.
If we were to frame the rest of the discussion for today around how that guilt can be relieved in other ways. So we've talked about it in a policy-making perspective. We've talked about it before on the podcast about from the applicant's agent's perspective, right? Just don't be an asshole, right? That helps. Be human, be available, open door policy. Let's have a conversation. Let's try to understand this together. I suppose we would probably want to add the political pressure.
Yeah,
when an officer feels pressured to run past interference for members, which compromises their professional integrity.
Yeah.
I imagine in some cases.
Yeah.
Like hashtag not all, but it's still going to happen that there will be something that they personally, as a professional planner, would recommend for approval, and they're pressured not to let it go forward. And judicial review, I would say, as well. Can you think of any others? I don't know.
The use of ChatGPT to object to applications. Give me the list and just populate the name. Maybe that's another pressure point.
I think that is such a weird but real but weird problem. But it shows how easy it is to corrupt the integrity of the moral indignance that goes into like every, letter of objection. You can make the letter about something that you actually don't really mind.
Yeah, or know about.
Yeah,
and that's the worrying bit.
Taryn, what about you? If you were a policymaker, monarch for a day?
It's maybe covered by some existing policies, but a much greater focus on interdependencies, and maybe a policy in itself that requires decision makers to consider how one thing affects another, because it does feel like a lot of the time when you read reports or you get one set of consultee comments back from one officer and another from another officer, and it's very clear that they haven't been in a dialogue and it's been a siloed discussion. So I think having a policy requirement to ensure that doesn't happen, and that interdependencies and potential situations where you can't possibly make both things acceptable at the same time and there's a trade-off to be had there. I'm not sure how you formulate that into a policy, but that's just something that I think is so fundamental.
I think that actually would be interesting, because the case law already establishes that it's the principle of the planning balance is the purpose of having a decision maker. And it doesn't normally say that in a development plan. It won't say like, guys, this is ideal for every single thing. There are going to be trade-offs. And we've talked before about the possibility of a development plan being clear about priorities. And I think implicit in a priority setting is an explicit recognition of trade-offs in the statutory plan.
Yeah.
That's a really good one. Looking at it through that perspective of removing the guilt from the officer's decision-making process and to really empower them. And empowering them might mean being clear about what's expected of them vis-a-vis development plan policies.
Yeah.
And then also removing the sort of perverse incentive pressures from stakeholders that are making it harder for them to be confident in that ability to say, honestly, this is fine.
Yeah. At the end of the day, even if we disagree with them sometimes, they are professionals, they're experts, and still trying to do the right thing. And then if they don't have his support, if they're being constantly challenged, that undermines them.
Yeah.
I would hate to be in that position. I actually feel a lot of respect when they're under all that pressure. But like having said that, that also makes sense if they are under that pressure, if they're making some odd decisions or recommendations that don't make sense, not the sympathy by there. But I think that's probably one big challenge for the system is that pressure. They might have different parties all pulling them in different direction. And to be the person in the middle trying to resolve that and compromise, that's very hard. And I think there needs to be an element of actually how do we move away from that and let them do their work, even if nothing else for their mental health. I think it's quite important.
That is a really important point. I had this boss who once said, I don't need a group to agree, I need a decision. And I think that is an important distinction. What you were saying reminds me of that.
Yeah.
So far we've talked a lot about our experience of being on the side of proposing development, but now might be a good time to say that you've just been appointed on the Merton Design Review panel, so you'll be in a slightly different role there, reviewing development. So first of all, congratulations. But are you looking forward to getting that different perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really excited because, as you say, Taryn, it's being on a different side of the table. Look, what we're assessing here and actually what does good look like, and how do we balance the local planning policies, the needs, but also wider aspirations in terms of we're facing the housing crisis, but we also want to make the particular place where we've got applications, raise the quality, the placemaking element of that. And from my point of view, also support the applicants. We can criticize things to any degree, but it's actually how can we find the good in that and how we can focus on that. And yes, look what might need to improve, but also support the process, support the applicants, and enable the development. So coming at this from a slightly different angle maybe than other people. Professionally, I am, without a doubt. Like, I'm not an architect. I obviously worked in development. I'm an engineer, project manager. Work closely with the design teams on a day-to-day basis, closely involved with design, familiar with all the policies and constraints and trials and tribulations. But for me, being in that role, it's about enablement rather than just sort of being the maybe slightly harshly critical friend. I think that's important to have in mind. Looking for the good things, but I'd rather like to see something that's really good, built, used, lived in, celebrated, than something that's 100% perfect and does never gets built. Like, that to me is sort of, we've lost the battle, if that makes sense.
It's much more powerful and important to engage critically with an application than to point out its imperfections.
Yeah, and look, being on this side of the table of the applicant, understanding kind of what they're going through, is having also a bit of sympathy for that. But as I say, obviously balancing that element, balancing with sort of the needs of the local community and balancing the policy requirements, trying to marry all of that up. And like, I've been in situations professionally where you focus on some detail that down the line nobody will ever know about or care about.
Back to your spreadsheet.
Well, there's a spreadsheet. One of my favorite example is the bins at the power station. So I keep telling that to everyone. Everybody just looks at me like I'm some weirdo. So white bespoke bins, although they're all the same. Again, you would look at them, just see their bins, like, great, but nothing special. They were made out of the chimney rubble. So the old chimneys, when they were demolished, there was a lot of rubble kept so they can be integrated into the bins and recycled. From like recycling point of view, great. But from the story narrative point of view, will you ever be able to guess, walking around a power station, that those bins were made out of the chimneys?
I very rarely know where my Portland cement is from.
Portland. Or maybe it's from Puzzoli. Anyway.
I do like a little flourish, but then you're right. There's got to be a line somewhere between the sort of sustainability, the fact that you can make a sustainability narrative and be really cute about it, which are separate things, and then also the significance and the cost.
This was more driven by the story, like retaining the heritage in terms of essentially taking something old, giving it a new lease of life, and keeping it there rather than sustainability. Because I'm not entirely sure how sustainable it is. People probably might criticize me after I say this, how sustainable it was to recycle, because you have to crush them. Then you have to crush them to like specific sizes. There might be an element of actually they don't have the particular strength, etc., etc. You might not be able to reuse a lot, so it's only tiny fragment. They might be more sustainable, maybe not, I don't know. But it's a story that's prevalent here. But that story, you need to tell every single person who walks by those bins and be like, by the way, do you know that those are recycled chimneys? So kind of, you do all that work for something that will get lost. So that's, for me, an example of detail where the narrative is gone. Like, we've taken time, effort to design them in, to do this, but nobody will be able to appreciate that.
But the applicant felt the pressure to have that narrative for planning.
I guess so, yeah. But kind of goes to that point around being mindful of the detail and will it necessarily make sense? Because, look, it does make sense, right? But when explained.
Yeah.
But then you have to explain it every single time. Or you have to put big signs on the bins, this is who they are and this is what they're made of. But it loses its point. So there are also other elements where you can be so precious about something and it also doesn't achieve that effect. So we focus on the detail. We lose the sight of what are we trying to do here? We've got a housing crisis. And today, like when we talk about housing crisis, there was an article in the FT, slightly shocking. Probably we're all aware of that. Last year, there were 5,891 housing starts in the whole of London.
Yeah.
That's like, when you look at some of the major cities across the globe, that's the lowest of them all. That's the lowest in the long history. We've got quite a big challenge here to solve. And it's kind of shocking because it's about future generations. And by future generations, I mean like people who are now in their 20s, early 30s, whatever. It's not like future generations 20 years down the line. It's people here and now who's got that issue. And we need to work for them. We all collectively need to put that at the front and center in terms of people have nowhere to live. families that are getting bigger.
Yeah.
They don't have a place to move. We're not providing housing. We're stuck in this issue of viability, various challenges. How do we unlock that? And how do we become a bit more pragmatic to achieve that?
Honestly, even we millennials got shafted, and it's only getting worse.
Yeah.
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 I think that's a good place to end.
Fair enough.
Marko Salopek, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Marko Salopek of Muse, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Miriam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.